I was being systematically groomed and conditioned to self-subjugate and self-gaslight and cooperate with an authoritarian model. I had to get to a place where he was about to kill us, and I had to realize I was grooming the next generation of abusers in order to put my foot down and say enough is enough. I heard a voice in my head, in my mind, in my heart that said run, and he had gone to his office to get his gun. So if I had stayed, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. And we drove away.
I'm Mia Freedman. You're watching No Filter.
Thank you for having me.
You want to start with the sad stuff? Sometimes you have those days.
I just cried. I just bawled my eyes, and I don't know why.
If you can't be wise, be kind.
I never cry in No Filter interviews.
It was sort of just opening my eyes to a new world.
I love it. I live it and breathe it.
Tia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You start your story in 1984 when your family moved from Michigan to Florida. Talk to me about your early years and the way that your family changed when you made that move to Florida.
When I was 10, we moved to Jacksonville, Florida, and my parents wanted to give us a good childhood, a protected childhood, a happy one. And in Jacksonville, the message was all over the city that the best way to do that was to join the biggest church in town. So it was a Southern Baptist megachurch. We had 3,500 members at that time, and then it quickly grew to 10,000 and then 20,000. And by the time I graduated high school, we had our sanctuary sat over 10,000 people. I was there 6 days a week. It was a lot of fun. I would not have pointed to a lot of it as being particularly traumatic or problematic. I was being systematically groomed and conditioned to self-subjugate and self-gaslight and cooperate with an authoritarian model. But I didn't know that. I knew that I was just having this Christian evangelical experience that had a lot of money and privilege attached to it, and I didn't know any different. I talk about this sometimes like a culture within a culture, and it's based on the verse in the Bible that says, be in the world, but not of it. And so we really were practicing a parallel Christian culture in the world, but not engaging with the world, not informing our worldviews, not growing and into adults. We were growing to prepare to be Christian wives and mothers, and that is all. And so that was my second 10 years. I got married at 19.
You call it a cult without walls,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting because by that I assume you mean it's hiding in plain sight. And you talked about it's a mega church. So it's not just like a fringe few kind of people meeting in a basement. It is like literally tens of thousands of people. What is the IBLP and who is it Gotthard or Gotthard?
Yes. Well, Gotthard is how we say it, but it's spelled Gotthard, which is just so funny to me. But Bill Gotthard started the Institute of Basic Life Principles, the IBLP for short. There's a headquarters in Australia. There's a headquarters in America. His model of growth cross-denominational lines in that he taught biblical principles. So Christians from churches all over would come, and then they would be sent back out to their churches to proselytize within their congregations for this stricter form of Christianity. If you're familiar with the Duggar family on TLC's 19 Kids and Counting, that's the most visible family of the Gotthard system. I was in Shiny Happy People last year, and that did a big expose on the IBLP and how it works and how it has gone into, because of its agenda, it's gone into every branch of government and the entire evangelical movement. That's why I call it the cult without walls, because we were part of this high control group with very strict criteria that meets all of the cult definition, but it doesn't have a building. And so people identify with cults as like it's a place you go and it's a single person you follow. And that is not how high control religion works. So I believe it does meet all of the cult criteria, and it does cross if you listen to survivors, you hear from multiple backgrounds, all kinds of different evangelical sects and denominations with very similar experiences.
What's the role of the Duggars in the IBLP and Gotthard, as the leader of that church?
They were kind of reputation ambassadors. They had some influence and sway, but they were one of the star families because of the number of children that they had and their high visibility and their political involvement. But really their role was lifestyle evangelism. So their purpose was to show the world what a great lifestyle this is so that people will feel attracted to it and choose it. And it worked in a big, influential way in America. Plenty of people watched that show just to kind of watch the car accident and the crazies, but plenty more thought it was an enviable way to live. And the trad lifestyle that we find ourselves in today is in large part influenced by fundamentalism on TV.
How did that man and the IBLP change your experience of being a girl and then a young woman?
So it was an invisible influence for me in my high school years because I didn't know about him. I knew his people were around me and I was observing them and I was learning all their special rules. And I was observing that there was this way in our church to be a special kind of Christian, a holier Christian, somebody who was more devout and more sold out and serious in their faith. And that it had a lifestyle projection in that they wore different clothes and they had lots of children and they decided to homeschool their children. And so we had a lot of respect and reverence for them. Not everyone wanted to live that way, but it seemed very much like an option you could take. It wasn't a serious pursuit of mine until I was married and very quickly a young mother, and I was in abuse and I needed to keep my baby quiet at night. And I turned to an older mother in that system to teach me how to help my baby sleep, but also keep the home. It's called Keepers of the Home. And so I wanted to be a godly Proverbs 31 woman and be good, at what I was trying to be, which was just a Christian wife and mother.
You talk about in your book that at 14, when most young girls are at the mall and shopping and maybe getting on Instagram and posting selfies, your job was to prepare at age 14 to be a Christian wife and mother within the church. What did that preparation actually look like?
Oh, that's a great question because we weren't actually preparing to be wives. And if they had been teaching us, here's what you might practically face as a wife, I might have had some more tools under my belt. Instead, it looked like a lot of what you don't do. It was very heavily focused on purity culture and remaining a virgin, not tempting men.
What's purity culture for someone who's not familiar with purity culture?
Purity culture is an entire culture that's built around keeping you sexually pure. So it includes modesty, so that you're learning how to dress in a very modest manner that won't tempt men. It also includes your behavior, your speech, being modest in all ways. And we call it purity culture here because this is the idea that your behavior can make you impure and that you're trying to stay pure so that you can be an undefiled bride for your husband.
I want to ask about modesty because what does modesty actually mean in this context? Because for most people, modesty means you don't go around perhaps big noting yourself, you have humility. But that's not what this kind of modesty in religious fundamentalism means. Can you explain what it is?
Yes, that's the big irony is that modesty, especially in scripture, has a lot to do with your bearing and behavior. But what it's become in evangelical culture is a hyperfixation on the length of a girl's skirt and whether or not her bra strap is showing, or Bill Gotthard has a teaching called eye traps. So these are the way clothing is designed to draw your eye to, say, a slender waistline or cleavage or something that might attract a man's attention. And that is ruled as immodest clothing. Your behavior can be immodest in that you can be loud or laugh too loud, be ambitious and try to lead or stand out in any way. That can become a thing, but it's all external.
Is it about sexuality? Because it's at an age, a 14-year-old girl, she's growing breasts, she's menstruating, she's suddenly aware that men are looking at her in a different way. She's maybe feeling hormones, she's maybe feeling things. In fact, she no doubt is all of the things. Mm-hmm. What were you taught? How were you taught to interpret that all of that was dangerous and that it was sinful and that it was your job to protect men from the sin of you?
Yes, it's completely internalized. The actual scripture says that if a man lusts, he should pluck his eyes out. It never mentions what the girl is doing, but we flipped it. The evangelical culture flipped it. It was all focused on first how we were dressing and being, but then eventually our very worth was sinful, distracting, dangerous, tempting. I interpreted the things I was feeling as a sexualized young person as those were my temptations to sin and step out of the will of God. So I was constantly suppressing any urges or attractions or desires so that I wouldn't feel them. It's very important to not feel them so that you can remain pure. And then it's supposed to magically turn on when you're married, which we know now it doesn't for a lot of women. Sexual dysfunction is very, very high because our nervous system does not acclimate that way. That's not how the human body works.
I want to ask you about your wedding night in a minute because that was really what you talk about in having to turn everything on, literally like a switch. I guess you didn't kiss any boys when you were a teenager, didn't fool around, or did you? Did you get to do that?
I had an early sexual assault when I was 13 that I interpreted as maybe my first kiss. I wasn't really sure. I didn't have anybody to talk to about that. And I had one kiss with a boyfriend otherwise, but no, did not have any real experience before my wedding night.
How did you meet your husband?
Yeah, so this big mega church I go to or went to is Jacksonville's a port city. So we have a naval port, and he was a sailor that came in on a ship and attended our Navy ministry. We had this big military ministry to reach the sailors for Christ. And they come in for, community and to meet girls. So that's what happened. I went to a hayride and he was there, and we met at a mixer near Christmas time. And about 4 weeks later, we were engaged. I didn't really know him, but he had decided that I was the girl he wanted to marry. And I was in pursuit of a husband at that time. I was very open to this is the only thing I can do with my life is to be a Christian wife and mother. So I need a husband to do that. So I was primed and ready to receive whoever said they were God's will for my life.
Did having a job or a career ever occur to you, or was that ever presented to you as a possibility when you were a teenager girl?
It's a grief. I share in the book how I learned to split myself. I had dreams and desires and opportunities and talents, and I had to learn to suppress them and stuff them down. They were not in accordance with what I was being told was the only acceptable outcome for my life. And it was unbearable to feel the loss of them. So I learned to stuff them away. And there was a season where I wanted to be an artist. And I thought, if I'm an artist for God, I can do it. That's how I'll get through this. And that didn't work because I was chosen for marriage first. And so it just didn't work.
You talk about being chosen. Did you want to marry this guy? Was he nice? Did you like him?
I didn't really know him. I did not feel attracted to him. And I know in hindsight that if we had given it natural time, to unfold, he would have shown his true character. He was, he had behavior tendencies that were carefully masked under charm. And that charm would have fallen away if we had given it more time, which he knew. And that's why he needed to secure me so quickly. So I was very locked in very quickly and did not feel like I really had a choice. By that point, you don't believe you can say no to a man or to God. And they are one and the same.
So when he decided that he wanted to marry you, you kind of just, was it an option to say no? Or you were like, yeah, I need a husband. Like, why not?
It's a great question because I just feel for little 19-year-old me who really didn't spend that much time thinking that. I think I project onto her that she wanted to say no, but I think that she actually didn't spend that much time deliberating. She'd been taught that you are going to say yes, and that's how you're going to know it's right. If you're asked, then you know it's right. And I was very practiced at shutting down my signals, my arguments, any resistance I had. And I instead funneled that energy into talking myself into it.
Tell me about your wedding day. Did you like it?
It was magical. I did love it. My parents went all out. My mom's a seamstress. She spent so many hours on my dresses and my bridesmaids' dresses. And we had a very traditional wedding, and it was near Christmas time the following year. And so it was just, I took advantage of the whole season feeling festive. And we had a horse-drawn carriage, and I had a cape, and it was romantic and candlelit and really beautiful. I mean, it was not smooth and without issue, but I was overwhelmingly really happy. And I felt like I was celebrating this launch into the rest of my life.
You say you had a very traditional wedding. Before you walked down the aisle, your dad was like, "Are you ready?" And you said, "I can't see."
Yeah. My veil was heavy chiffon. I wanted it to drape differently than the bridal tulle. Bridal tulle is very puffy, and I wanted a romantic drape. So I'd picked this fabric. It looked gorgeous in photos, and it looked gorgeous by day, but we were standing in candlelight. And so when we flipped it over my head, I couldn't see anything. It was a shrouded woman, and I had to walk the aisle blind.
Which was very symbolic, wasn't it?
It ended up being quite metaphorical, yes.
Your wedding night, what did you know going into it about what was going to happen on your wedding night?
I knew that we would have sex. I did not fully understand what sex was. I knew there would be insertion of anatomy and that it would hurt, but that it would be romantic and loving and God designed. And so it would be okay, that I would be held and caressed and cared for. We had a book by Ed Wheat. It was called Intended for Pleasure. And then also, like, this is what they tell young fiancés. We had been in an engaged class and had premarital counseling through the church. And so there was no real sex education or instruction or transparency, but they did, set us up. We also read Elizabeth Elliot's Passion and Purity, which talks a lot about remaining pure until your wedding night so that you can give yourself as a spotless woman to your husband, and you will be rewarded with great pleasure and married passion, and it will be beautiful and procreative and Song of Solomon level joy. That's a book in the Bible that talks about sexual pleasure.
Sounds awesome. Is that how it went down?
Doesn't it? That's not how it went down. What actually happened is that I had 3 sexual assaults on my wedding night, and no language to describe that or a way to ask for help or explain. And a week later, I ended up with a raging infection and a doctor who shed light on the fact that there had been battery involved and violence, but I really did not understand what happened on my wedding night until a good 14 years later, when I was finally given language for marital rape and what consent means.
I'm so sorry that happened to you. It's shocking, and when you talk about it in the book, it is so shocking. I don't want to make you relive it. But was there a part of you that thought, "Oh, this doesn't seem right"? I mean, it sounds like maybe there wasn't, because there was no consent, because you were his property as well. Consent wasn't something you even knew about, was it?
Not at all. That is not a word I knew until I was out of this marriage. Part of that is just culturally, we didn't have very much of a conversation around consent. The therapeutic language that we have available to us today has evolved because survivors and because of researchers and therapists. And at this point, we're in 1996 in the story, I did not have that.
What does the term quiverfull mean?
Okay, so this is based on a verse in the Bible. It's relating children to weapons. And if you're going into war, you want lots of weapons. So the verse says, "Weapons in the hand of a warrior are children unto the Lord. Happy is the man that has his quiver full of them." And so that is a metaphor, that a child is an arrow, and you want a quiver full of arrows for your culture war against the West and against secularism and everything, democracy, everything that the Christian nationalists and the dominionists are against. In the Bible, of course, this was the psalmist. So there was an actual war that they were talking about with the weaponry that they had available in Bible times. The Quiverfull mindset in the evangelical movement was promoted through Bill Gotthard's institute. He did not author that. This is just what they latched onto because dominionism is their underlying theology. They want to dominate the world's government through population. So they want to have as many babies as possible without stop.
Which was turned into such a kind of a funny, quirky joke on 15 and counting or 16 and counting with the Duggars. But from what you say, there's something a lot more insidious about it. It's literally repopulating the world with a particular type of fundamental religious belief.
They want white Christian babies. They want to dominate elections and population with an ideology that is not pro-democracy. It is not equality or freedom. It objectifies children because it reduces them to a number. And there's a host of lifestyle accommodations that come with that kind of backwardness that modern society would ordinarily reject.
You were careful to say in your book that your world was not fringe. It was very mainstream, and that's how it thrives. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, and the Duggars, again, are going to serve as a really good example. This is a lifestyle. When we talk about it, the tendency is to say that it was fringe and extreme, except TLC put it on TV, and it had, many years of seasons and lots of money and millions of viewers. They promote themselves as a innocence and a wholesome aesthetic that's very appealing and attractive because who doesn't love rows and rows of beautiful, obedient children and sweet babies? And the women involved want motherhood. I always say fundamentalism exploits the thing you wanted for yourself. I wanted motherhood. The mothers I knew all wanted motherhood. And it's the very vehicle that they are reduced by until sometimes the point of death.
You say sometimes until the point of death. Do you mean that they are encouraged to keep having pregnancies? Because I thought this for a long time, actually, about Michelle Duggar. I'm like, it's not safe. She'd had cesareans. She'd had complications. She was still trying to get pregnant and have more and more and more babies. Are women really just seen as baby factories, essentially? Is that the role of women within this system?
Breeding cows. Women are seen as breeding cows, and they're interchangeable. And they die from things like ongoing uterine issues, prolapsed uteruses, cancer, early cancer diagnosis, exhaustion, depression, lack of resources. And then they're replaced with a younger model who will continue having babies. I mean, it's that happened again and again. We would see a mother die in her 30s, or early 40s from essentially exhaustion-related causes. And then replaced with a younger woman, and she'd continue having babies for that man.
It's interesting what you say about also, you've written about how the wives have to talk in a very quiet voice. I mean, anyone who's heard Michelle Duggar and watched that TV show, it is so unthreatening and soft. And you write it's on purpose, like the trained childlike voice, fundamentalist women are trained to adore their men by offering their rapt attention, even if he's an idiot, even if he's not saying much at all, even if you have an intelligent point to make. He's your head. He's a conduit of Jesus. He's amazing. And of course, you're also his consumable resource. So don't be surprised if he's up in your business, undresses you with his eyes, wants to devour you, invades your space. Oh, is that what your life was like? How did that play out?
Well, in my case, I don't know if we can say fortunate or not. My husband really hated physical contact and sex. So in my particular case, he was not in my business very often. It is a miracle that I had the number of pregnancies that I had.
Because when you say in your business, to be clear, you mean sexual assault and rape by husbands of their wives.
Right. I do. I feel entitled to women's bodies, and they're raised from childhood to believe that. Most cases, most of the survivors I talk to, frequent assault is just the norm, and they don't know any different, and they don't even know to call it that. Those, again, not vocabulary available to us. It would never dawn on us to say no because we haven't been able to say no about anything else. And they've never heard something like, if you can't say no, then you're not free to say yes. It's just they got married. Their marriage was consent, period. That's the world.
Did you ever step out of line? Did you ever talk to your husband? Did you raise your voice, talk to him in a way that wasn't adoring and approving? Because these women are also humans. So
Yes.
what happens? Did that ever happen to you?
I think this is part of my self-preservation. Yes, it happened to me. I was raised, my parents actually, they just took us to church. They weren't high control people themselves. And I was a spirited child. I was raised to run and play and explore and do things like that. So being married to this did not come naturally to me. I was constantly at war with my expression. And I was also getting in trouble for things that weren't really wrong. So I was always trying to suss out where the line was, what is small enough for you, because sometimes just my breathing could make him angry, or an expression, an opinion at the table. You're not supposed to have an opinion. But I'm somebody who is a lot. I am a lot of person. I am a lot of expression, and I have ideas and dreams and thoughts and opinions. And I was also the more mentally capable parent for my children. So a lot of times I didn't agree with what was going on, and I would push back for their sake to be protective. And that usually would get me in some serious trouble and consequences. So I think that's descriptive of most of my years with him, is that there's this dance happening between us.
How soon after your wedding night did you have your first child?
I had a miscarriage 3 months after our wedding, and then I had my first baby. I was pregnant 6 months later, or 3 months after that. It was 6 months after the wedding. And so he was born the next year.
How did having a baby and becoming a mother, which was clearly your job description and your purpose, how did that change the dynamic within your family, and how did it change your life?
It was also my dream. And so again, I split in this way because I loved being a mom and I loved having my babies, and I wanted every single one of them. And it was always a tension within me, because because I wanted them doesn't mean I wanted one a year. I wanted to give my body a break. I wanted to give us, as a newlywed couple that was struggling, some time and space to find our feet. I thought I had sound arguments for using contraception, and I did use contraception on the sly, even though I was heavily trained not to. I was really trying for our health to not do that. And it also just really upped the stakes, because now there's a child involved and then children involved. And it's not just me anymore that's going to pay the consequences. And I so badly wanted to give my children a happy childhood and a secure home. So it just made me dig in harder. I didn't have any way out. So there was not a lot of time spent dreaming of escape. I dreamt of salvation. I wanted someone to come save me and make it better, but I didn't dream of escaping, because divorce is absolutely forbidden. And they would probably rather you commit suicide than die than divorce. But of course they don't say that, but in general, if you die, it's a little bit nicer than if you get a divorce in that circle. So I didn't want to do either. I didn't want to die, and I didn't have access to a divorce.
Because women were so in the church, it was so consumed, and are the ones that are still there, of course, with looking after, up to a dozen children, sometimes more, but many children very close together, which puts an enormous amount of pressure. And often these women are very, very young when they become mothers. What did the church and the IBLP tell you about motherhood and parenting? There was a list of things that you could skip, wasn't there? How did that work? And what was on that list? So in my work today, I have a list. I started compiling that list, and I call the series Things My Gotthard Fundie Mentors Said I Could Skip to Have a Quiverfull, because there was a whole long list of ordinary things that I took for granted that were part of child rearing that they just didn't do, so that they could have more babies. If you did that thing and it interfered with your decision to have more children, then you stopped doing that thing. Can you read that list to me?
These were forbidden. And I just warn you, the list is jaw-dropping. Well child visits and pediatricians, academics, haircuts, shopping, play dates, socialization, extended family gatherings, birth control, rest, mom friends, a second income, the entire concept of being a teenager, toys, snacks, education for girls, gynecological visits, consent, sleepless nights, privacy, the dentist, separate bedrooms, baby food, pants, voting, therapy, art, and debt.
What do all of those things have in common?
Oh, they have many things in common. One of the largest is mandatory reporters.
So to keep you away from anyone who could alert authorities to what was going on.
Exactly. Agency and ideas that you might have options. That's a big piece of the why you would not have academics in your home school. We weren't allowed to go to the library. This is a partial list. We weren't allowed to go to the library. We weren't allowed to educate our daughters, because why do they need college? They're going to be just wives and mothers. So their education really stops around 6th, 7th grade. And then they become just little mothers, para-mothers, to prepare to be a wife and mother. And then they're skilled at being keepers of the home. We don't want our daughters knowing consent. We don't want our boys to feel like they need to ask for consent. The list all has a very subtle sales process. I was like, shouldn't I take my child to the pediatrician? I should get them their vaccines. No, you don't need to do vaccines, and you don't need to do well child visits, because the pediatrician will pressure you to use Western medicine. And we don't use that. We don't use doctors.
You don't use doctors?
Only in case of emergency.
You had 4 children very quickly. You actually had 5 children very quickly. Mm-hmm. But one of your daughters, Clara, died at 9.5 weeks old.
Yes.
I'm so sorry for the loss of Clara. That must have been impossibly difficult. How did that thrust you into the world outside the church? Just because of hospitals and doctors? She was born with a heart condition, wasn't she?
Yes, hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which is where just half of the heart develops. And after she was born, we traveled out of state to have surgery. And so I was immediately immersed into a world where women could be doctors, women had jobs, women used childcare. I was alone and apart from my husband. I was apart from my babies and my mentors. We were in a completely different environment and believed that we were on the way to wellness. It was definitely with that mindset that we were going to get better and go home. And I include her story in the book the way that I do, because the entire experience of Clara absolutely broke me open. It broke the spell of mind control. I had never lost anyone before I lost my daughter. And so it was just jarring and shocking all by itself, all for the reasons that anyone can imagine. And when you lose a child, but the experience was so complex, and it was impossible to box myself back up after. I could not be the person I had been. And there was a great demand on me to become that again. When I got back home, there was so much pressure on me to not grieve too long. Don't make people uncomfortable with your grief. Get back to business quickly, have another child, give God all the glory. And I just couldn't box myself into that anymore. She made that impossible.
And there was no therapy. There was no, in that list that you recited, mum friends. Mm-hmm. You couldn't even talk to other women.
No. And if I did, the only women I would have been speaking to were my mentors, who would have been schooling me to more practical activity and husband obedience. Like, there's no compassion, empathy, friendship.
Tia, it's The Handmaid's Tale.
Well, I call my story the prequel, the real life prequel to The Handmaid's Tale. And it's important to note that Atwood used real Christian fundamentalist groups as her model. Like, she didn't make that up. Everything in her books already happened.
What did the church teach you about discipline and obedience, both of your children and of yourself?
High control, it has to have a method. So one of the things that's true in patriarchy is it's very fear-based. And they're terrified. Like, these fundamentalists are not evil, crazy people that want something different than the rest of us. They are just like you and me, and they want comforting answers. They want reassuring binaries. They want organization in times of chaos. And they want happy families. And successful children. And so they're convinced that if there aren't this high control model, that their children will go bad and that they will lose them into a lake of fire. The stakes couldn't be higher because it's an eternity in hell. And so all of that convinces parents to do whatever their authority tells them they need to do. And there's no shortage in patriarchy of resources encouraging parents to treat their strong-willed child, with a rod of correction. In this environment that I was in, and that is just so alive and well today, one teacher really does lead to another, and one book leads to another. And so the ideas in one book will build off of that and take you to the next level of extremity. And while everyone may not achieve that far end extreme, where in my story it includes disciplining wives as if they're children and wife spanking, maybe not everyone experiences that. A lot of them experience a lot of harsh corporal punishment of children. And on the very beginning of the spectrum, babies, because Michael Pearl's books talk about switching through blanket training, which begins at 4 months old.
What's blanket training? Can you explain what blanket training is?
Yes, blanket training is a behavior modification practice that begins in infancy. So as soon as the baby starts to move, you put them on a blanket, and every time they try to crawl off of the blanket through a normal child development of exploration, you stop them and swat them and tell them no.
When you say swat, does that mean hit?
Yes, you hit them with any kind of switch, approved switch. So they recommended a twig, a stick, a twig, a piece of plumbing, PVC plumbing pipe, glue sticks, flexible craft glue sticks. There's a number of implements they recommend, but you start as a baby and you teach that baby to not move, basically, unless you've given it permission.
My God.
It's barbaric.
It sounds illegal. Is it not illegal?
It should be. Oh, it should be. In America, spanking children is legal, and children have died from it, but they are still publishing and they are still practicing. And this movement fights very hard in court to protect parent rights over children's rights. So in the Christian patriarchy, children have no rights, neither do women. And so that's not the mindset they're operating from.
You mentioned wife spanking.
Mm.
Did that actually happen to you?
It did. It's a practice called Christian domestic discipline. And I said in Shiny Happy People, like a careful read of these books on discipline, Michael Pearl's To Train Up a Child being an example of many, they don't have an age limit on when you should stop spanking your child. So if you listen to survivors of these movements, you will hear older daughters spanked by their fathers into their young adulthood, and you will hear wives who have been spanked. It is tied up in the theology that tells a man that he's responsible for everything that happens in his home, and he's answerable to God for all of the behavior. And so that's how it's sold, that you need to hold her accountable and train her because her choices are going to reflect on you on Judgment Day.
Women can't vote, can't they? Can they? They're not allowed to vote.
It's not as clean cut as that. I was not allowed to vote, and they don't prefer women to vote, but they will utilize the female vote if the popular numbers are close. And in American elections lately, they've been very close. And so women are allowed to vote, but they're expected to vote in compliance with their head of household.
So their husband tells them who to vote for.
Yes.
You mentioned how Clara, then losing her, cracked you open. Was there a definitive moment when you decided that enough was enough?
It took me 7 more years to reach that point. I really came home from the hospital with this endeavor to be the best Christian wife and mother I could be. I felt emboldened in my faith. I felt empowered by Christ. I felt like I'd seen an example of strength and power, and that I could color inside the lines, so to speak. And that really did work to a point. I had 2 more children after Clara and 4 more pregnancies. So it was life. I did not realize that there was not a entertaining again of getting out. It's till death do you part, even if it's at his hands. And it did come down to that. I think one of the traits that I have as a as a Christian girl groomed to people please and fawn, I tend to stay in environments longer than I should. I can see the writing on the wall, and then I lack the courage to save myself and take myself out of that. It's a life discipline I'm working on. And this is the biggest example of it. I had to get to a place where he was about to kill us, and I had to realize I was grooming the next generation of abusers, in order to put my foot down and say enough is enough. And then when you try to leave an abusive person, it becomes much more dangerous and violent. And that's what happened. The violence escalated.
You wrote in the book that as you began to find your power, your husband reacted very badly. And you wrote, balance was a delusion. As I became more independent and healthy, high control religion and domestic abuse tightened their grip. My husband became more erratic and dangerous. In October of 2007, things came to a violent head and I narrowly escaped with my children in the middle of the night. What happened on that night, if it's not too distressing to recount?
Sure. I'm going to give you like the high level version. I knew that I had to leave, and I had been making arrangements to leave the next day with my children while he was at work. We had gone trick-or-treating, which was the first time our children had participated in Halloween. It was part of a kind of new progressive community that we were in, and I felt like excited that they could do that as their last, I didn't want to take that from them prematurely. So we had gone trick-or-treating, and after we got home, he had some sort of psychotic break. I really don't have good language for what happened inside of him, other than that he snapped. He held me hostage for 4 hours with a length of firewood, threatening to kill me and kill the children. And then he suddenly left. And I heard a voice in my head, in my mind, in my heart that said, run. So I packed us up, grabbed the laundry and the children and my laptop, and I left. And he had gone to his office to get his gun. So if I had stayed, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. And we drove away.
Oh my God. How old were your children then?
They were 10 and down, 10 to 2.5.
How old were you?
I was 33.
And you mentioned grabbing your laptop. There was a group of an online group of women who became your lifeline and really showed you the door and the possibility that there was a way out. How did you come upon them, and how did they play a role before that night happened?
Yeah, way back, if we go back into the timeline to when Clara died, just after that, my oldest was old enough for homeschooling. And I had stumbled on the homeschooling forums that had just formed. The internet was brand new. We were all pioneers in this new technology. And so I had a way to connect the outside world from home. And it is a big, big through line of how I survived this mentally, how I educated myself, and the connections that I made that were outside of the religious groups that we were in. And they were other Christian women going through very similar dynamics with different expressions. Like none of them were like in as much high control as I was, but they had toxicity in their marriages, and they had family dynamics where we could relate to one another and talk in a real way about what the kinds of things that we were facing. And I had also started a business by the time I left, a blogging business, and I had a successful website at that time. So I grabbed my laptop because I knew my livelihood was in it and all of my contacts. And those women helped me hide. They sheltered me and took me in. And I do believe, I know that we're seeing this again. There's underground railroads forming of women connecting to women, helping one another out of dangerous situations. And in America, helping women get abortions, helping women find healthcare and resources and get out of domestic violence. So they saved my life. They really did. And they kept my children's world somewhat balanced during that time.
Was there a moment where you thought, okay, I've done it, I've left, and I can't return to that life?
It was that night. Yeah, that was done. It was a complete severance.
And what happened after that? What was the next 12 months like for you and your kids?
We had to go into hiding. We started divorce proceedings, which had to be separated from the custody proceedings because those required investigations, forensic investigations. The violence continued, and it was about a 10-year process of all of that. You don't get divorced cleanly from someone like that. and easily. But I was also going through trauma therapy through those years and putting my life back together. I mean, I really did set to healing, raising my kids, securing my employment, getting on my feet. And I had it in this context that this bad marriage happened to us. It wasn't till years later in therapy when I had to start like reversing my decision-making process and exploring what made me make those choices in the first place. What made me go along and comply. And that's what led me to the religious trauma and understanding the grooming and conditioning I'd been part of as a younger woman.
How do you unbrainwash yourself? Because essentially you'd been brainwashed since the age of 10 about how you think. One of the things that struck me so much in your book, you wrote that you couldn't even write a journal because you didn't even have any privacy of thought. You were worried that God would see it or that your husband might find it because you had no right to say, no, I don't want you to read this. How do you undo that?
It's a mixture of big bingy growth spurts and then a lot of careful day-to-day retraining, rediscovery. I prefer like to emphasize curiosity and question asking and meditation. I have come up with my own steps of recovery and my own process of healing, and I've had breakthroughs along the way that I'm writing about now. But there were also giant moments. Like when Clara died, that was a giant moment where a lot of the spell was broken in my mind and I was curious and wanted to learn. And then there were harder times where I have deeply embedded patterns of fawning and people pleasing and cooperation and that I have to really work on situation by situation and carefully with a therapist. So it's a little mixture of both. But I did not accept that I wouldn't heal. Like, I want that for my life.